In the next session, Aruna Nambiar, author of The Monsters Still Lurk, and Priya Balasubramanian, author of The Alchemy of Secrets, will be in conversation with edX's chief reporter Daniel Timaya on the anatomy of a character.
Good evening and welcome to the New Indian Express. Thank you for joining us for the Dakshin Literary Festival 2020. We're super excited to be bringing you authors and reading from the south of India, for the south of India and the world really, at a time when books have probably been one of our very few respites. It's been a long and hard pandemic and the fight is far from over, but we have two women who have enthralled us with their words and whose books have brought a lot of joy, and in the case of Aruna Nambiar, a lot of laughter as well. So join me today in welcoming our two panelists. We have with us Aruna Nambiar, who is the author of the delightful Mango Cheeks, Metal Teeth, and more recently The Monsters Still Lurk, two books that I think were absolutely fabulous for their take on Indian families and the kind of inherent humor that she's managed to throw in there, and I would highly recommend that you read both of them. Aruna's talking to us today from Bangalore. We also have with us today Priya Balasubramanian, who's joining us all the way from Sacramento in the USA, and she tells me that there's a second wave that's coming on and that things aren't looking as good now, but what she does tell me is that she's come off some very grueling shifts at the hospital. She was an alum of CMC Vellore and she's a gastroenterologist, and she promised me that she is going to stifle those yawns because it's quite late at night there. Thank you for joining us, Priya. Today we're here to talk to them about the anatomy of a character, because they've had these really intricate characters that they've crafted, and these characters are as Indian as it gets. Priya's character is of course somebody who comes back from the US and is set in Bangalore, and Aruna of course has a litany of characters centered around the great Indian family and all of those tirades and politics and insults and everything that goes into it, and I'm sure she has a lot to tell us about that. Aruna, let me ask you right away. I mean, you're somebody who's had a lot of geographic identity when it comes to your books, your characters. In your first book, of course, you had a lot of small town Kerala, and in your second book, you've had a lot of Chennai, you had a lot of Bangalore, you had some Pune, you had characters come from all over the place. So let me ask you, how important is it to set a place that you know and to have your entire book sort of set there? I mean, why is it important that the location feels familiar to you as an author? And how much of an impact does it really have on the way the book pans out?
Well, location is essential because it kind of evokes, it evokes a setting for the reader. The reader needs to be able to see whatever you are seeing in your mind's eye, So you want to bring that alive for the reader. Now, there are reasons why you choose certain locations. In my first novel, Mango Cheeks, Metal Teeth, the setting is actually small town Kerala, and it's a social satire, which is it's a coming of age story and a social satire, and it is set over one summer vacation. In my first novel, Mango Cheeks, Metal Teeth, the setting is an ancestral home in Kerala.
Please go.
And the whole family, the Nair family, has gathered in this ancestral home for the summer vacation. And, I wanted to capture that whole experience of going back to the ancestral home for the summer vacations and meeting up with cousins and aunts and uncles and all of that, because that was a very typical experience for us growing up, and it's not an experience that I feel the new generation has in the same way. So that's the reason I chose small town Kerala, because it was an experience which was familiar for me, and I wanted to recreate that for the reader. In my second novel, The Monsters Still Lurk, I've actually set it against the backdrop of post-liberalization India. So it starts in 1991, and it comes to, it follows a quarter century of a family growing up and growing old. And the reason I chose that is because I wanted to actually explore how India has changed in the last 25 years since the economic reforms were introduced by the Narasimha Rao government. Because for those of us who grew up in pre-liberalization India, the India of today is, inconceivable. The fact that we would have so much affluence, so much consumerism, we would have information at our fingertips. So I wanted that to be the backdrop. And I chose urban India because urban India is the India which has changed the most. So that was the reason I chose these backdrops. And I think they're important that your settings come alive for the reader.
And I think it helps it keep, your characters very real, because when you know a place as well as you do, I think the story really connects with the readers in more ways than your characters sometimes do. Priya, let me bring you in there. Let me ask you the same question, but with a little bit of a twist. Your story, The Alchemy of Secrets, is sort of an ode to Bangalore. I mean, if you've ever been to Bangalore or if you've grown up in Bangalore, like you have, a lot of people will relate to the amount of Bangalore that is in the book. Do tell me why it was so important for you to set those characters in a city that you grew up in, as opposed to, say, a city that you live in. Why was it so important for you?
That's, I think Bangalore is still the place that I know best among like all the places I've lived in. And for me, it has a certain fondness in my heart, which I think some other places come close, but Bangalore is probably the place that I love above all else. And so when I was writing this book, it just made sense. It was a joy to go back to Bangalore, every time I was writing. And this is a novel which took me many years to write. So the whole Bangalore thing was somewhat selfish in that it gave me an added incentive to keep writing. So, and there's a small part of the book that is set in rural Karnataka on the Gold Coast, but you're right. I mean, the book is an ode to Bangalore. Aruna spoke very beautifully about having having the kind of impetus to evoke a place for a reader, and I think that's what all of us aspire to do and succeed to varying degrees. But for me, I think when I was writing, I was just trying to recreate the Bangalore that I saw in my mind's eye on paper. And, it's true that when you're a writer who is living in the West, say, you want to kind of guard against exoticism. You don't want to make things seem you don't want to put things on display for the Western eye, so to speak. So I think what I tried to do was speak to my truth and the truth of what I saw. And that was kind of my guiding principle throughout, was to write the things that I thought would plausibly happen, and the people that would plausibly populate that space.
Aruna, let me bring you in here, because you talked about how a lot of your commentary is about, the great Indian family and the whole lot of fun that it, as a writer that you have when you take these apart and you bring these characters in, you bring them together and everybody thinks, hey, I've got an uncle just like that, or, oh my God, my mother actually said that. It's interesting when we think about how much of humor can be had when you write about the great Indian family. As we increasingly enter a period when people are looking at Indian stories more than ever, and Indian novels are sort of, the flavor of the season, and people are looking to go global with these stories, how relevant do you think these little intricacies of Indian families are when you look at it for a global audience? Do you even think about it that way, or do you typically think my reader is Indian and hence my characters have to be true to the story? What's your take on that?
One thing I've realized, Daniel, is that one should never second guess the reader. And one should not, one thing about writing is filter out all the external noise and not worry about who's going to read the book or whether the book will sell or who will. You have to find a story and be true to the story and be true to the characters. And that's how you write a good story. So what I also feel is that, literary sensations, books which have become sensations around the world, whether it's Elena Ferrante's Neapolitan novels, or Isabel Allende, or Chimamanda Adichie's stories, which is about the Biafran War. They are not necessarily relatable to people maybe living in the US or in Italy or in India. And yet, people have read them widely and they have found them to be relatable. So readers, you never know what readers relate to. And readers read not just to relate, but also to discover new worlds. So as a writer, my concern is not to make a story relatable to somebody sitting in the US or even somebody sitting in Assam. So my first novel, Mango Cheeks Metal Tea, is based in 1980s Kerala. So initially I did wonder whether, and it's a very strong South Indian flavor. So I did wonder whether, somebody in the North would appreciate the story. But I've had people from Assam, from Goa, from Varanasi telling me, oh, it reminded me of my childhood, and they could relate to it. So that was nice to know. And similarly, with Monsters Still Lurk, it's a story about family and aging, which is set, which harks back a lot to pre-liberalization India and so on. So I was wondering whether, people of the current generation would relate to it. And yet I find a lot of youngsters also read the book and they say, oh, it reminds me of my mother, it reminds me of my grandmother, things like that. So one should not, I think one should not second guess the reader, and one should not tailor one's writing for any market, one's focus should be on writing a story which is true to the heart, and which does not strike any false notes. And I think it will find resonance with people everywhere. And certain themes are universal, wherever I think, wherever whatever your culture is and wherever you are living, you will find a resonance with it. I think so. That's my opinion.
Priya, you of course live in the US, like we mentioned earlier, so you probably have a ringside view of how these stories are looked at abroad. Now, I understand that not every book that gets published in India is easily available, either as a paperback or in any sort of physical format across the seas. But do tell me, how is the consumption, and how do people, say in the US or in Europe or anywhere else really, look at Indian stories? Do they actually relate to it?
So, even though I live in the US, the Alchemy of Secrets is currently only published in India. So there's very few people who have read it in the US, and they tend to be people who are other writers and friends. Most of the writers who've read it have read it in workshop or, in a full draft form. They're, teachers or peers. And so their feedback has, been the kind of feedback you would get from fellow writers. And I have to say, they were all extremely supportive. And there's actually a very small number of, I would say, readers who have read the book in the US, because we're still trying to sell the rights, US rights. And I hope that there will be more. But to speak more broadly about, Indian fiction, I think readers in the West are actually quite familiar with Indian stories and Indian fiction, because, we kind of come on the heels of giants. So, I would say that it's familiar territory for a lot of readers in the West.
Aruna, I know that Monsters Still Lurk deals a lot with aging and the concept of it, and there's a little bit of philosophical dint to it almost. But I really must ask, because your forte with the kind of humor that you bring into it, and I don't want to keep harping on it, but your treatment of the Indian family and the sort of stories that are there tend to suggest that you sort of enjoy telling these stories, and you sort of enjoy bringing these people together, these characters. So tell me, what is it about the Indian family that draws them to you to want to be able to write about them as much as you do?
Firstly, I didn't set out to write about Indian families. My first novel was actually exploring the theme of when children first become aware of social differences. And it's couched in this family story and in this comedy of errors, but that is the underlying theme. And actually, in Monsters Still Lurk, I wanted to explore aging. But what I found is, when I started developing the story, what I found is that there were so many aspects of aging that I wanted to explore. How your relationships change with your family, with your children, how your children finally become your caregivers and caretakers. You change with the changes in society. So much of all of that. So I found I needed a multi-generational family saga to do justice to all the underlying themes. The other thing is, I think family is so much a part of Indian life that every story has a family angle to it. You'll see even love stories have a family angle to it often. So I think it's just part of our DNA. And for a humor writer like me, I think families are irresistible because they're full of these oddball characters.
That's very true.
Whether it's your father who will forget your birthday, but he'll remember how much a bus ticket cost in 1968, or a grandfather who tells you ghost stories, or even a maid who's a raging hypochondriac. So there are these irresistible characters in real life, and you want to for humor, it's sort of ripe for humor. So in that sense, I think families are kind of irresistible for a person who writes humor.
And Priya, what was your experience when you were writing Alchemy of Secrets? I mean, did you have the same sort of urge to sort of bring in all of the experiences and people that you'd seen and all the families you'd observed and all the bad humor that brings forthwith to put into your book? Or because your book is about how a girl comes back, from so many years in the US, and she comes back to Bangalore, and that's Meera's story. Of course, there's a lot more that happens to the book. I'm not going to tell you about it. But is your approach to Indian families and how you write about it typically the same?
So, Alchemy of Secrets is a sort of multiple perspective novel, right? So the whole family is kind of featured in the cast. And this is something that I think is, in my mind, is somewhat more Indian because, a lot of Western novels tend to be kind of the lone protagonist who sets off on his own. And there's a certain style, to that kind of novel. And I always felt, as I was writing it and going to workshops and, we were all sharing chapters, I wondered why, I had to have this kind of what almost sometimes felt like a cacophony of voices, right? Because there were so many people that were stepping up to speak. And yet I felt like I couldn't really tell the whole story without everybody's voices, because it's really the story of a family, even though you mentioned this before, Daniel, it starts off by being Meera's story, but you can't really tell the story of Meera's life without telling the story of her mother, her grandmother, her uncle, her aunt. And so to me, that's very typical of the way we experience life in India, because our families are always around. And I can't think of many times that I was by myself without kind of this supporting structure of family, either as a young child or now as an adult. So I think, we kind of tend to write what feels true to us. And family is center stage in the Alchemy of Secrets.
Aruna, it's interesting that you had a character like Vivek, who's a protagonist of Monsters, take us through that journey, and it's quite a philosophical and social take on things, if I may say so. But it does bring us to the larger question that there is this. In 2020, we have lots of conversations on Twitter. Feminism is no longer considered something that only angry women talk about, and people are quite lit these days. But despite all of that, I'm certain that you often get this vibe that people still believe that women's stories and things about women's issues and feminism are best told by women or through women protagonists. Is that something that you see as a myth? Is that something that you see going away? Because I'm certain that there are lots of great authors who have looked past that glass ceiling and have sort of written stories that appeal to both sexes. As a woman writer yourself and somebody who is vocal about how these biases should not exist in writing, how do you view this?
Actually, I'm very conflicted about this whole women's writing and women writers, because on the one hand, I do understand that there are certain things that impact women more, and we are in a better position to write about it, whether it is sexual harassment or an inequitable treatment in the workplace or at home. So these are things which impact women most. So women would obviously write about it more than men, and we are in a better position to write about it in a more authentic fashion. But that doesn't mean that we should not write anything else. And we should not be talking about women's writing as though women only solely write about women's issues. Because, we had Agatha Christie writing Hercule Poirot in the early 1900s. and Daphne du Maurier used to write these lovely, sinister, paranormal stories. Yeah, and Daphne du Maurier wrote some lovely stories, The Birds and The Blue Lenses, which are, sinister and have elements of the supernatural in them. Then you have, of course, the story which is considered by some to be the first sci-fi story, which is Frankenstein, written by Mary Shelley. So there are so many examples like that. At least for the last 100 years, women have been writing on various themes. So I don't know why we are sitting in 2020 and still talking about women's writing in that sense. So I still do get that, I didn't know women wrote humor, or, women could be so funny. But a lot of women's writing is, women writers are funny. So you look at Bridget Jones' Diary, for example. It's called the mother of all chick lit. So I think there are these, gender biases in how women's writing is viewed, and I think we should stop having these questions about women's writing, and stop. I had this pet peeve about panels on women's writing. So.
Priya, now you actually spoke about how your characters and this book itself has sort of stewed and reached a level where it was good to go over a period of about a decade or so, you said. And over that point of time, obviously you've grown as a person, as a writer, and you've sort of evolved with so many things happening in the world around us. And with all of that taken in, how do you see this perception that, women tell better stories? And having had a typically women protagonist in your book, Alchemy, do you subscribe to that norm that sometimes women's stories are best told by women through women?
Meera being a woman is kind of central to the book. I think of all the voices in the book, of all the perspectives, I think one is male, and that's of Girish's, Meera's uncle Girish. And when I was writing, I don't think that I was consciously making choices about gender. This kind of the gender of the characters is kind of what's inherent to the story, and I imagined them as people, and if that makes sense. And some of them were women, and some of them were men. It turns out that they were more women than men, but I think I don't think Alchemy would have been the same if the genders were reversed, if there were more men than women. I frankly think it would have been less interesting for me to write. And that may be just, personal preference. But writing a male character that I disliked was actually one of the more challenging parts of the book. There are other male characters who are sympathetic, Meera's father, Adil, and they were all, easier to write than the character that I disliked. So I think that had more to do with my kind of feelings towards that character and the necessity to humanize him than it really did with his gender.
And Priya, considering how long it's taken for you to write the book, I'm sure that there were a litany of experiences and things that you've been reading about in the media, things you've been hearing, historical happenings. America had a first black president, a first-term president now, and so many things that are going on. The BLM movement is huge. It's probably rewritten the racial story in the 21st century. Do all of these sort of tend to factor in consciously or subconsciously in the way that you frame characters?
All of these characters are products of our imagination and our subconscious, right? So it stands to reason that they're manifestations of everything that we experience in the world. And I think when we write, it's a very intimate kind of act between yourself, your subconscious, and the page in front of you. So I think what it does kind of translate to is that your worldview is laid out on paper for everybody to see. And a lot of it is unconscious. I think when we write, people get an idea of sort of what's in our deepest mind, I think, when they read, the things that we put out, whether we mean to or not. So, for instance, in the Alchemy of Secrets, there's a lot of politics. There's a lot of meditations on caste and prejudice and things like that. Those weren't things that I was kind of consciously trying to write into the story, but they appeared. And I think that's probably the way it is for most writers. You know, we start out trying to tell our story, we create our worlds, and those worlds are reflections of the way we perceive the world that we live in or we've experienced in some way. So you know, I think the Alchemy of Secrets was set in India, and it has a lot to do with kind of the communal politics, corruption. You know, there's parts of it set during the emergency. So politics is integral to the book. And I think if I were to set a book in the US in the last 4 years, or you know, even the years that are coming up on us, it would include a lot of themes that I experience on a day-to-day basis, you know, which would include feminism, BLM, and you know, just kind of the misogyny or prejudice that I would you know, that manifest in this world.
And I think that's very important for us to take away, to remember why the people who tell us the stories want to tell those stories, and why these characters are shaped the way they are. Thank you so much for a terrific discussion, ladies. And that truly is the essence of it, isn't it? Because you've got to be true to the story, and it'll be great if you can make the audience smile, laugh, or cry just a little bit along with you, because your reader and the story are absolutely supreme. Thank you so much, ladies. That was a scintillating discussion, and we've got a real insight into how you guys make your stories stick. Thank you very much for joining us, Priya. Thank you very much, Aruna. And we really hope to look forward to a lot more from the both of you.